Welcome back to the Zeitcast, where we talk about intersections of theology and culture, spirituality and culture. So here's what's happening today, and I want to jump right in. Some of you got to meet Andrew Whitehead a few months ago. What an incredible experience we had bringing him to DePaul for our Mendenhall lecture. Professor of sociology and executive director at the Association of Religion Data Archives. Uh, his book, American Idolatry, How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church. I've given that to so many people, Andrew. I think it's such important work.
Oh,
And of course, the
thanks.
lead author of Taking Back America for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, along with Samuel Perry, the foremost scholar of Christian nationalism in the field. And Andrew, I told you right before we started, I feel like this is asking like quarterback of a football team. Hey, I know you're playing in the Super Bowl this week, but also would you have time to chat with me? So thank you so much for making this time and space. That really means the world.
Oh yeah, totally. No, it's so good to be with you, and yeah, I look forward to the conversation.
So this may be really jumping in the deep end of the pool, but I mean it when I say, and of course, gosh, even conversations I've had this week about how influential
Hmm.
your work and witness have been to so many people in terms of just um, the the hard work on the data side, but then also as a person of faith, just who you are, a humble person, a kind person, a person who loves Jesus, loves the church, and that comes through so bright and clear. So what I want to know is that and how you answer this, the conversation can go in four or five different directions because of course I have a couple questions, but really I just want to start here. It sure seems to me that everything that you've been working on for so long, not that it will resolve in a couple days, one way or the other, but is reaching a kind of crescendo, a kind of fever pitch. All of these broader themes of Christian nationalism, where and how people find meaning at the intersection of faith and politics. I'm desperate to know what it's like to be inside your head right now as you're watching everything unfold. What feels hysterical and we need to be nearly that afraid of that, or I don't think people are nearly as afraid as they should be of this. I'd love to see a glimpse first of just how you're doing in the midst of all this when it just hits every intersection of all the work you've been doing for years.
Yeah, that's such a good question, and I don't know if you want to be inside my head. That would probably be pretty scary. No, I mean, yeah, it is a moment. I think coming in on the election next week, where it feels as though this election season has been going on for so long, and it really has, right? 2 years ago is when Donald Trump said, I'll be running in 2024. That was kind of the first person to say, I'll run again. Obviously, we knew at that time President Biden would likely run again. So we've been in election season for 2 years, which is
Yeah.
so long
Yeah.
and such a slog. And here we are, a couple of days away from election day, and early voting's been going on across the country for days now. And to be really honest, it goes back and forth for me where
Mm,
tracking Christian nationalism, looking at the implications of it for our democracy, for the Christian faith in the US and globally for years now. Um, you know, a lot of what I do as a sociologist, as a social scientist, with the books that I write and presentations, I think the role that I've found that I really can play is to deliver empirical evidence of
mm,
what Christian nationalism is, the implications of it for democracy, for Christianity, for religious freedom and pluralism. And many times the story there is a tough story to tell and to
yeah.
receive, right? It can get pretty dark and pretty scary because, as you're pointing out, there are real threats
Yeah.
to democracy. We see rhetoric really ramping up where one of the candidates for president is saying we have enemies within,
Mm,
right? Calling other Americans enemies. That's really dangerous. And we have already, the results of the election saying, we may, we're going to question those. There's things happening. All of
mm,
that is taking place. And for scholars that track democratic decline, we're
mm,
hitting those checkpoints. So those are real threats. And then too, to see Christians really embracing rhetoric that is very derogatory towards others, and all of this taking place is really scary. And so, even just this morning, Jonathan, I was woke up and couldn't sleep. So I was like, well, I'll just get up. There's no use just laying here. Um, and and I was feeling that kind of angst and anxiety that
Mm,
I think a lot of us feel right now because we want to live in a country where we can differ on policy preferences, but we don't demonize each other,
sure.
right? Just because we might vote a different way, it doesn't mean we're enemies or we hate each other. But when we have a candidate that won't, peacefully give up power, as in the last time, all those things make it very different election this year. And I think
Yeah.
most people are tired. But I was sitting there and feeling that anxiety and angst. But there was a moment where I was like, you know what? No matter what happens on Tuesday, our role as, for me, a person of faith and a Christian, or for, I'm sure, other people of faith, but also too for our neighbors and friends of no religious faith, but who care about their neighbors, our job doesn't change, right?
Yeah.
No matter what happens on Tuesday, whoever, and we won't know probably, even Wednesday morning, we probably won't know yet because
Sure.
votes will be counted, but what we're here to do, what we're all about doesn't change. And I think that is looking out for those around us, for our neighbors,
Mm,
especially for those without, the number of privileges that I think you and I, both have as men and white Americans, natural born citizens. There's a lot of things that are in line for us. So how can we leverage those things to help defend and protect and enfranchise the least of these, those around us who may be more in the crosshairs of what could be coming than we are, no matter
yeah.
who's elected or not. And I think in that sense, I actually found, with some of my thought train at that point, that maintaining hope and recognizing that throughout history, people have had to live under and push back against powerful forces bent on destruction.
Yeah.
And that's nothing new. And so here we are in this moment, trying to meet the moment the best that we can. And that's enough, right? That we have each other, we will find each other, we're going to keep moving, keep pushing
Mm,
forward, and we can do what we can, where we can, however we can. And that is enough. And if we need to take a step back,
mm,
we can, others will fill in. And then when we're ready, we can get back in and we just resist. And I think in that resistance, I think there's hope. And
mm,
so, you know, Kamala being elected will not solve our problems. Trump being
sure.
elected will not be the end of the world. And so we continue on the journey together. And I think that's where I was trying to find hope this morning, that
Mm,
that that is where I'm at and trying to live in, because I think when we give in to cynicism or we give in to hopelessness, I think then it becomes more dangerous. Then we become where we're just going to sit back. But we have agency. We
yes.
won't solve it, but we can continue on. So that's my kind of rather long answer, but it is such a difficult time, anxious time,
Mm.
and there's a lot of moving parts. And so this is kind of where I find myself today in this moment. So,
It's really good, Andrew. And part of what I love about what you're doing and just the work that you do in general, I mean, immediately, not only trying to help us think through and think what reasons to remain hopeful and to stay engaged, but also situating in a larger context, which is why I find so much of what you do sanity restoring for me. Okay, let's see how does this story connect to larger stories, and
okay.
and where that when you talk about the escalating rhetoric, because I know starting well, and again, I know the story in terms of Christian nationalism certainly doesn't begin in 2016, but there are a lot of things that ramped up in 2016. I remember then, because race matters so much to me, feeling very much at this point discipled by these amazing luminaries in the Black church. Um, it was always the rhetoric around race that concerned me the most. Now, of course, to this day, especially among Christians, I feel like I've yet to meet a racist, because I mean, everybody will tell you they are not a racist. I mean, I'm not a racist. I mean, what do you mean? Like, that's no one admits to being a card-carrying racist. But do you ever have moments now where even after 2016, 2020, the rhetoric in particular around race feels heightened right now in a way that I don't know that I could have even imagined 8 years ago. I mean, do you have moments where you really have a sense of looking over the top of the building and like, is this more, it just kind of tracks with where things have been moving? Because it just seems like that rhetoric right now just feels especially extreme and pervasive.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the way that I think about it and see it is that we aren't in coming up against anything new, just like you had
Sure.
said, right? This has been a part of our story even before the dawn of the United States. Race and racism and the structural inequality, all of those things have been in place, and beliefs about race go hand in hand with that,
Yeah.
right? And so that isn't anything new. So I would say, and I'm not the first to say this, but it makes sense to me, where history may not repeat itself, but it often rhymes,
Mm,
right? And so we are in a moment where I think things are coming to the surface, which means that decades ago, it doesn't mean they weren't there, but they didn't have an opportunity to bubble up quite as much, right?
yeah.
And so we're in a moment where, yeah, I think things are bubbling up and to the surface. Things are being revealed in a sense that have always been there. And I think, 100 years ago, they may have been bubbling up similarly. And then 200 years ago, there were moments. And so, in moments of structural and social demographic change, things feel uneven and uneasy, and people are looking for explanations. They're looking for safety. They're looking for an understanding of who we are and what we're all about. And I think when we're talking about race, when we're talking about Christian nationalism, these are those moments where we are undergoing change, right?
Mm,
The United States is shifting demographically. It is shifting, and in a decade or two, it's going to be where there is no majority racial or ethnic group, and so people are feeling that. And so I think in that sense, the unease is real,
mm.
but they're kind of looking toward and kind of grabbing scripts that are old, and we hope we can start setting aside those scripts and start using new ones, racially, whether it's the Christian church, right, to really set aside some of those racialized scripts that we've have been a part of American Christian history, or even as Americans, whatever religious faith or none. How can we move forward with that? And that'll just continue to take work. But yeah, I don't know that. I think you're right in saying this isn't necessarily anything new, but it is a moment where it is reaching a crescendo. It is
Mm.
bubbling up in a way that is unique over the past, and maybe our lifetimes, which are getting longer now, but
Sure.
aren't super long. But I think yeah, in our lifetimes it is something new.
Mm. That's so helpful. I'm wondering because when I have conversations with folks, especially white evangelical adjacent, Pentecostal
Hmm.
charismatic, so much of the world that I come from,
Yeah.
when I have this conversation with them, I feel like what I always hear, in particular with regards to Trumpism, like the whole thing, what people will tell me is that um, I'm still for, because I don't really know. I don't know a lot of people in my life who are wildly enthusiastic about Trump in those spaces. What I feel like I'll hear is that, well, I think he's better for the economy. Um, Inevitably, something about like inflation, Biden, like et cetera. Yet, and I really try not to be unfair here, as much time as I spend watching campaign events from both sides, I feel like I almost can't find snippets where I hear an economic plan. What I feel like I hear over and over again in ways that are just feel increasingly insidious. Tried to watch some of the rally at Madison Square Garden on Sunday. Like so much racialized rhetoric where it seems wild. Like, oh, this is a place where you're going to bring this in. How do you even find a way to bring it back to that? So I'd love if you could speak to some of that discrepancy of how often I feel like people of faith in particular will say, I'm for Trump because of the economy, but what I feel like I hear from him in the campaign is almost always highly racialized rhetoric and very little with regards to any kind of a coherent economic message.
Yeah, no, I think it's true. I think that kind of speaks to we're in a moment where, for Trump and I think the religious right, Christian right, it has become more about identity, right? That
Mm,
we are people and this is our group and this is our person. And that is the result of many decades of kind of organized, focused work to activate white evangelicals and adjacent groups to vote Republican, whereas they weren't as politically engaged in the 60s and before. In the 70s, this was a distinct outreach to those groups. And so Trump, in many ways, is that natural culmination of that. He isn't anything new, but he's a natural culmination where for decades people have been told and pastored and taught that, this issue, whether it's abortion or homosexuality or some of these cultural wedge issues, this is the top line. Like, you can't not vote for somebody who doesn't believe exactly this.
Yeah.
And everything else can be thrown by the wayside. And so, with Reagan, that really solidified, and Trump in many ways is a mirror image of Reagan, where it has less to do with the personal religiosity or whether this person individually lines up with our beliefs, but will give us access to political, social, cultural power, which is what we want, because this is our country and this is what we're all about. And so I think Trump does that, but what we're seeing really is a degradation of our political discourse of that group, because they're willing to throw in with this person. So you have kind of online instigators and personalities, right, on the Christian right, who are saying, I think Allie Beth Stuckey is one example, where she's saying, whatever the rhetoric is at Madison Square Garden, and if people haven't heard, go read an article of what was said or go watch some clips. It is disgusting what was said, and that is the GOP right now. This is their platform. She says, well, as bad as that might have been or could have been, it isn't as bad as the other side, which she said and claimed were, essentially worshiping killing babies, right? Which again is this nod towards abortion and how that's been kind of taken as, this is exactly, why we have to line up between this, for this other person. And so while that is disingenuous and not true, what she said, I think logically in that worldview, that's what it's come down to. And so they're willing to make space to where, really white nationalists feel very comfortable. Right? There's pictures of folks flying Trump flags with Nazi flags underneath. Like, these are literal white nationalists feel comfortable there. And so Christians we should be asking ourselves, why would they feel comfortable, in these spaces, for those that, vote for the GOP. So those are things that we have to continue to wrestle with. And I don't know that we have, or for these groups have yet. And so I don't know what that'll take, but again, by the end of next Tuesday, this will still be our reality, right? We still have friends, family members, all these folks who still see this as the Christian vote, the way Christians should vote. And so the work, I think, in that sense is ongoing.
The abortion component is especially interesting here, while the Trump campaign continues to both seem to want to try to reassure evangelical Christians that will continue to attempt to restrict, if not outright outlaw, abortion, while also trying to signal to people who don't want to hear that we will not restrict.
They're claiming abortion. Both. You're right. Yeah.
Well, fascinating. That's simultaneously happening at the same time. When you talk a bit about and you use that language a few times now, about the threat to democracy.
Yeah.
I'm really curious, especially with regards to your work, so much of which does involve data, research, historical movements, how Christian nationalism, historically and currently, connects with fascism, what's in the water there, if anything, what we might be looking for, because obviously that word is still a bit controversial to use. You get pushback when you use it, and yet it sure seems that there is a tendency. I often just think about, I was literally having a conversation with a friend the other day about some of the kind of church leadership books I read back in the day. John Bevere had a book called like Undercover, and some of these books about like spiritual authority, and thinking like, wow, really kind of sets you up for, Moses comes down off the mountain and the person with the authority, whatever they say, goes. And to question them is to question God. I'm just curious what your sense is in terms of the relationship between Christian nationalism and fascism, how real that is, and how imminent of a threat that is in this particular moment.
Oh gosh, yeah, that is a key question, an important one, and I could go on for quite some time. And so I'll try to limit, but there is a lot of empirical data that underscores the connection between Christian nationalism and authoritarian social control, like fascism.
Mm.
And so that's kind of the top line story. It is a strong association, and I can point to a couple resources real quick, and then I'll kind of unpack this a little bit. So I wrote an entry into my Substack looking at Christian nationalism and authoritarianism, right, and kind of highlighting some of these overlaps. And I think that is kind of the ground that gets kind of tilled up, where we can see this comfort for authoritarian social control and fascism take root and then bloom. And then also the Public Religion Research Institute had a survey from earlier this year and put out a report, I think in September, looking at the connections between Christian nationalism and authoritarianism. And so I'll begin by saying, when we define Christian nationalism, and this is empirically supported definition that we use in our research and then in my writing, it's a cultural framework that desires a close fusion between a particular expression of Christianity with American civic life. And it wants the government to uphold and defend that specific expression of Christianity as central to American civic life. And so the key there is a particular expression of Christianity, because it isn't all expressions of Christianity, right? They wouldn't necessarily be open-minded about more progressive expressions of Christianity being instituted. It is a much more conservative, theologically, politically expression. And while that expression of Christianity does kind of look to some of the historic Christian beliefs, like God exists, Jesus is a son, came to save the world, however that might work out, Holy Spirit, all of these kind of historic Christian beliefs, that is a part of it. But it also brings with it this extra cultural baggage. And these cultural elements are wrapped up in that understanding of Christianity. So when we're talking about the Christianity of Christian nationalism, it is those historic Christian beliefs, but also it is a desire for strong ethno-racial boundaries around American identity. It is a desire for traditionalist social hierarchy, right? Certain people and groups should be at the top, others in the middle, and others at the bottom. And the other cultural element for that is a comfort with authoritarian social control. So within Christian nationalism, the world is viewed as a chaotic place, disorder, dysfunction, and what we need is strong rules and strong rulers or strong ruler to come in and enforce order, to enforce those strict boundaries, to enforce that hierarchy that we, quote unquote, believe that God has commanded for this nation.
Yeah.
And that is where we see over and over evidence of this overlap between Christian nationalism and authoritarianism. So a couple quick data points. When we ask people about political violence, ask Americans, those that strongly embrace Christian nationalism are more likely to agree that because this nation has gotten off track, we may have to resort to political violence to ensure it gets back on track. Or we may have to bring in a strong leader who may break the rules in order to get this nation back on track. When we ask about voting suppression, so whether they believe that voter fraud is running rampant, although there's no evidence of that, they are more likely to agree that it is. More likely to say that Americans have to pass a basic civics test in order to vote, right? All these different things. And so right there we see not only is there comfort with kind of violence or the threat of violence around our political leader and the outcome of election, but also support for undermining a democratic process to where the outcome then is in hand. And then we won't need violence, right? If we can limit. So it's viewing voting, engaging in democracy, not as a right of every citizen, but as a privilege. And privileges can be revoked, right? And privileges are for the true Americans. And so here again, with authoritarianism and fascism and that connection, we see Christian nationalism as providing essentially a permission structure, an overarching narrative and understanding, a logic that God has desired the nation to look a particular way. and we will not be swayed by democracy in order to see that outcome. And so we see it in real time, folks in these circles talking very glowingly about authoritarian leaders like
Yeah.
Putin, right? Franklin Graham, son of Billy Graham, saying, Putin, he could be a little questionable, but one thing he gets right is he really respects the Christian view on sexuality, right? Or folks that say, hey, Viktor Orban in Hungary, that's the way to do it, or even other religious nationalist leaders like in India and Narendra Modi. And so again, that overlap is key there. And so we see more and more, even in this moment, folks saying, Trump is an authoritarian dictator type of personality. Fascism is what he wants. His own chief of staff is saying he wants to operate as a dictator. He is fascist. And this is a person that served with him,
Yeah.
In the Oval Office. And so I do believe that threat is real, that is a real thing that we're up against. And Christian nationalism, again, provides that cultural framework that makes that seem, to many Americans who I know a lot of them are well-meaning, caring people, make that seem as the only possible way forward, because they've been told over and over that this country has to operate according to a certain way. God will turn, God's back on us, that type of thing. And so, there's more that we could unpack and talk about with sexism, with xenophobia and immigration. All those get wrapped up with authoritarianism as well. And those are all real threats too. But yeah, the cultural elements of Christian nationalism predispose it to seek out and support leaders that are dictatorial, right? That will just take control and have power. It is so. Yeah, in my second book, the central idol of Christian nationalism is power, the ability to get others to do what they otherwise wouldn't do, despite their resistance.
So helpful, Andrew. And I return so often to the way that you define Christian nationalism, the parameters that you give. Something that's interesting to me about that, because I find it to be that it all bears out over and over again, and yet not necessarily in the language. Now, more and more, I think obviously people are becoming more comfortable with self-identifying as Christian nationalists outright. Yeah. But a lot of it is not language that they would use expressly, but would be coded in some way. Like off the top of my head, when I think about, even like the idea that the world is wild and undomesticated and that we need a strong person. Well, because it's the end times. The Bible says we're in the end times. So then how that makes you, if a politician comes along and says, well, the cities are burning. Well, yeah, I guess the cities are burning because the cities have to be burning, that kind of thing. Yeah. I'm curious as to like anything else in that, in terms of how you would see the things you just listed, the way that they are coded in evangelical spaces, to where like, yeah, we might not say it exactly this way, but functionally it's what we're doing, but we're using a Bible verse, a theological structure, et cetera. Like, how do those things get coded in language that people really do use?
Yeah, no, I think that's a key observation of why, in many ways, Trump or the GOP over the past couple of decades have been successful in bringing, white evangelicals, mostly as a group, and other white Christians as a group, into the fold, is embracing some of that specific language that has been used in congregations and over time in writings that resonates, right? There's a resonance there where, depicting the world in a particular way and acknowledging that and using certain terms, I think, speaks their language without having to say the exact words, right? Yeah. And I think what you're highlighting is true, where, one thing that comes to mind is back in the Black Lives Matter summer, George Floyd, the protests that were taking place, and Trump had the National Guard clear Lafayette Square, and then he stood in front of the church holding a Bible, right? And he was asked, is that your Bible? And he said, it's a Bible. I mean, he's holding it upside down. And folks, look at that and are like, well, what's going on there? But it's maybe not in words, but in images. Yeah. It's showing exactly the type of resonance that there were people as interviewed as they watched that voted for Trump or who embraced Christian nationalism. You know, they understood the message, right? The message was being given, and they knew what they were there for and what it meant, that I am the protector, and here is our totem, right? And you can trust me, I will protect you in the midst of upheaval. And let's be honest, like, the nation was reckoning with some, you know, long history and pain, and that is uncomfortable. It's not unfair to say that, right? To look at all of that together is uncomfortable. How do we respond? Do we just negate it, or do we engage it? Do we press in or pull back, defend or accept? Right? Those are all choices we can make. And I think for many white Christians, it was defend, pull back, look for someone who will just make it go away, rather than how can we find a way forward together in better community. And so, yeah, I think the rhetoric and ability to speak in those terms, and folks on the right, and Trump especially over his time on the national stage, you know, since 2015, he's leaned into that more, and he's gotten better at it because he knows the resonance is there.
Well, and you highlighting even the way that imagery functions, because I'm thinking, like, any president of any party for however many years, I'm sure there have been plenty of times that, you know, they're going to have interactions with Pentecostal charismatic clergy who are going to lay hands on them and pray for them. But I've never seen so many pictures or campaign pictures where it really is like, oh, here's Donald Trump in the middle, or he's kneeling or whatever, and all these hands on him. And those images, the way that can speak even more powerfully in some cases than words to some of these implicit messages. Andrew, I'd love to know, especially as we're getting into Tuesday, because not just as a social scientist in general, but doing very specific, very particular work. I'm sure that as you read a lot of things, parse a lot of things, what are the kinds of stuff going on Tuesday that if we were having dinner tonight in Indianapolis, and we're just hanging out, and you were to tell me, like, okay, well, here's the things I'm really looking for on Tuesday in terms of storylines, who shows up, who doesn't. What are the things that you in particular are really looking for, knowing that this very well could be protracted, but like in the early hours, moments as returns are coming in, what's the stuff you're going to really be tracking?
Yeah, I think the first thing for me will be when polls start closing on the East Coast, just to know that we aren't going to know anything until, I'm not expecting to know anything until Wednesday, sometime Wednesday, about the state of some of those states. Because some of the states have had, you know, laws or resolutions passed where they have to start counting early voting on election day, which is going to make it take longer. Other states have started counting already. We obviously don't know those. That'll start becoming public then. But I think the main point for me that I'm thinking about is, in years past, folks will call states pretty quickly, but because it is so close, we're not going to know anything about, you know, some of those states until Wednesday. And I don't think we'll really have a good sense until probably later in the week about, you know, the West Coast and stuff, because I really think it will take time for much of that to roll in. So I think that's where I would want to start, is just because it takes some time doesn't mean there are any issues or problems. I just think it is going to take people, we're going to all have to be more careful now because of, you know, upheaval in the past. I think in that sense, then there will be exit polling. This is, I think, part of the problem with our media infrastructure, is that it really is kind of just about eyeballs and clicks. They'll say anything and do anything just to try to keep people. So much of the polls continue to, so I have the New York Times and Washington Post apps, right? And if you open those up, you're going to see, what are the polls saying and poll averages, and every day it changes, where it's Trump, you know, by less than a point, or Harris by less than a point for the battleground states. And the thing is that literally over the last 2 months, ever since Harris has come in, essentially it's been a dead heat. Even though they would say +3 or -2, it was always within the standard of error, to where essentially that means we don't know. Like, this could have went anyway. And so some of the way that gets reported is essentially untrue, when they're like, oh, Trump's inching ahead, or Harris is inching ahead. That hasn't actually happened throughout the past 2 months. But again, if they just keep saying, hey, it's still tied, that story gets old. And so, that's another part where even with exit polling and stuff, just waiting and being careful because it could say one thing or the other. Now, as that comes out, and that takes usually a week or two, I think the big thing will be looking at gender. That will be
Mm,
really interesting
mm.
to see both gender and then age. Who showed up where. That'll be what will be really interesting and fascinating. I think, for the most part, we can probably expect a pretty clear breakdown on the national vote, right? The popular vote. But again, that doesn't really matter. What matters is in the battleground states. And
Right.
so I think right now, Democratic, folks in that campaign for Kamala Harris are saying they have multiple paths to victory, whether it's Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, the blue wall, or the
Hmm.
Sun Belt, so Nevada, and then through, North Carolina, Georgia. They see Arizona, they see that could be one as well. So they're feeling confident, multiple routes to victory. There are folks that are afraid of, even a month or a week or two after election day, will the states send in their results on time? Because by
Yeah.
December 11th, they have to. So there's folks afraid of that. So there's so much unknown even after Tuesday that, again, the exit polling will be interesting. But even if there is clear outcomes from one point of view, whether those will be translated into actual institutional action, that'll be difficult. And so, sorry, I feel like I'm rambling now, but
Not at all.
there is just a lot of unknown and moving parts at this point. Will folks act, according to the rule of law or not?
Hmm.
We have to. I think those will be the things we have to watch for. And so I just don't know. It really is unprecedented times. We've never,
Yeah.
in our lifetimes, easily. Now, back in the late 1800s, there was, political violence after national elections, but in obviously this century and in much of the 20th century, we haven't had an election after an insurrection. It's been so
Hmm.
long, and that's what we're living through now. So I think being realistic about violence at the last election and an attempt to, overturn the will of the people that almost
Sure.
worked. We've never had a follow-up election to that, and that person is running again. That party still embraces that person. I think in some ways all bets are off. We actually don't know
Yeah.
what we're walking into.
Yeah.
And so those are the reasons why I think really keeping an eye on it and not necessarily thinking we're going to get an answer really quickly is key. But to be aware of what's taking place. So yeah, I think age and gender will be really interesting to
Hmm.
to to see who turned out, and then from there, institutionally, what takes place.
Yeah. That's so helpful. Well, and I mean, it really, we sit around, it doesn't feel that way at all. I mean, there's so many, it feels that there's there's the story beneath the story, there are the
Yeah,
intangibles, and so
yeah,
many variables that do feel pretty off the grid. I wish they weren't, but it's kind of, I keep waiting for some signs within the GOP that somebody would be pumping the brakes just a little bit,
yeah,
especially the things that feel like telegraphing. I mean, Tucker Carlson's line the other day about, you think she's really going to get 85 million votes, and it's like, oh my gosh, well, she may get 85 million votes, and that doesn't seem random to already be kind of be sowing. If she does,
yeah,
it's not
yeah.
legitimate.
Totally, totally. Yeah. And then Trump offhand at Madison Square Garden saying, "Oh, we've got a little secret." And then Mike Johnson
Right.
saying, "Well, we have a secret, but secrets aren't meant to be told, so we're not going to tell it." And, just kind of sowing that unknown distrust. Will they be bad actors or not?
Mm.
What will take place? And I've seen people all across the democratic spectrum disagreeing with each other that this isn't anything to worry about or this
Sure.
is really something to worry about. And so it's hard to know too how well will the institutions hold at this
Mm.
point.
Mm. You've been, again, I still want to honor your time, Andrew, but
Mm,
I'd love to ask you, because one of the
yeah.
things I feel like is so clear in your work and helpful for me is this sense of the indoctrination. There's such a theological component to all of
Mm,
this around
yeah.
Christian nationalism, like the religious nature of it is exactly what makes it so powerful in a way. It's
Yeah.
potent precisely because of its proximity to powerful images and ideas, some that have been redemptive, constructive, but when they're co-opted a certain way, um, do I want to know if you see any evidence in your life and the world around you at all.
Mm.
Do people who have kind of been indoctrinated that way, are they still changing their minds in real life? Does that happen? And if so, how does it happen?
Oh gosh, that's such a good question. I would want to start with my academic social scientist hat on and say that I haven't gathered any empirical data. I don't have any empirical data at hand to be able to really answer this with a lot of evidence
Yeah.
in that type of evidence, right? So I do want to say that. But anecdotally, right? So places that I go to talk or reading different pieces or even interacting with different folks, I do see that change is and can happen, right? We do see folks that voted for Trump in 2016, even 2020, that this time have felt as though I can't do this again. I don't want to do this again. He has, moved even further, in a way that they can't support. And so they're not. And so I think that is happening now to a large enough scale or anything like that. I don't know. And then two, I don't know exactly how they got there. But what we do know with evidence about folks that, make it out of kind of high control groups,
Right.
like white nationalists, what is it that changes their minds? How do people walk out of that? And, two, how do we change people's minds? What we find is that giving them statistics or data or even evidence as we see it against their point of view actually doesn't change their mind. It further entrenches them. And so a lot of what I've seen and heard anecdotally, again, that has had an impact is to the extent that the person feels safe, but maintaining relationship with them, but then also highlighting questions, right, and stories, kind of trying to activate that empathy towards the other, towards the person that maybe they don't listen to, stories they haven't heard, and asking questions in good faith of that person. So not kind of gotcha or trying to own them, but when they say, well, of course we know immigrants are stealing jobs or raising crime. Well, where'd you hear that? Or, what data, are you looking at that says that crime is increased or that diseases are broad or whatever? Where do you hear that? And most people actually have no idea where they heard it from.
Sure.
And it's not necessarily unfair, but it gives them an opportunity to maybe reflect on that, right? And so the questions that they carry with them, I like to think about it possibly as like a pebble in a shoe, right? As they move on in their life, it's going to stick there. And then keep bringing that up and allowing them and making space for them to have to engage some different muscles rather than just this identity, tribal group protection type of thing. I think that's where folks, have seen some evidence of change and some shifts in ideas where you can look at Springfield, Ohio, right? As Trump and J.D. Vance are elevating a story that was never true, had no evidence for. But what happened in that community is folks all across the political spectrum knew those people and knew that was a lie and moved to protect them as best they could because they were in proximity to them. And so if we can open up these spaces of empathy and story, I know for me, a lot of change that I've experienced in how I see the world is because I've heard stories from people.
Absolutely.
That I wouldn't have ever lived. I don't know what it's like to be a woman in America, right? I had students tell me what it feels like to have a man walk up behind them on the street. Even if they're in the middle of a busy place, right? It still is unsettling. I never experienced that because, because of my gender. But then as a man who tends to walk quickly, because I never think about it, now I'm aware, right? Don't walk up quickly behind a woman,
right.
even though I know I'm safe. She doesn't, right? And so as I hear those stories, I change my behavior. I see the world with new eyes. And that's the gift that people can give us. So if we can open ourselves up to that and hopefully open others up to hearing those stories and empathizing with those stories, that can help. I caveat that with it takes time. And we're in a moment where we don't have a lot of time. So we also have to try to defend access to the political process for those marginalized groups, but then also with those that are trying to take that away. Yeah, engaging in the long game of changing hearts and minds. But I think, yeah, a way of empathy and story is powerful in many ways.
A way of empathy and story. I love that so much, Andrew. And I do believe that those things are still happening. I'm with you. It's
I
like you
do
don't
too.
always know how to track it, but how do you
Yeah,
track what the spirit is doing in a way? I guess so
right.
that there are these currents beneath the current. Andrew, I cannot thank you enough for, in the midst of all the things, taking this time to be
Oh
with
no.
me and to be with us.
Yeah.
I will be building this as like an emergency episode of the podcast. It's
Let's
like,
do it again.
for sure. And it
Yeah.
might be a series of, we hope it won't be a series of ongoing emergencies, but if we need to,
Yeah.
like,
We need, yeah, let's keep checking in. Oh, I would love it. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I appreciate what you're doing. Yeah, on the ground at DePaul, with your platform, it's important work, right? And
Mm,
people are served by it. And so, yeah, I would love to keep the conversation going.
for sure. It is definitely sanity restoring and soul restoring. So
Same, yeah,
I'm
same
so
here.
grateful